Yes, good afternoon. I'm using microphone because, as usual, at our events, we are having online participants joining us from all over the world. So welcome to you here in Geneva, and welcome to you joining us online. As you know, today at today's event, which should be a very short meeting, taking advantage of the fact that we have ISOC's Vice President for Global Policy, Sally Venport, with us here in Geneva, should try to look behind 2015 and look ahead in 2016, provide views from the technical and academic community on what we can expect and how will the policy and technology developments interlink in the coming year. While we are waiting for Jovan to join us, as you know, there is an event running at the UNIDIR. We will take advantage for Sally and our colleagues from ISOC to know a little bit who is around the table, and also for our participants online to get an idea who is joining us here in situ. So if you can just briefly introduce yourself and tell us where you're coming from. Melissa.
Good afternoon, Melissa Keo, U.S. Mission to the United Nations.
Yes, hello, Pilar Escobar, Mission of Mexico.
Hello, I'm Elena, and I'm in the permanent mission of Italy.
Hello, I am Loyola from Globetics.net Foundation.
Good afternoon, Nigel Hickson from ICANN.
Hello, Shorat Zihetna from the Austrian mission.
Hello, my name is Katrin Kursamari. I'm from the Permanent Mission of Latvia in Geneva.
Konstantinos Komaitis with ISOC.
Constance Baumler from the Internet Society.
Hi, Nicolas Seiler from the Internet Society as well.
Stephen Brown from the World Association for Christian Communication, an NGO working on communication rights.
Sise Khan from African Civil Society on the Information Society, Axis.
Peter Gutels from the International Baccalaureate Organization.
Richard Hill of the Association for Proper Internet Governance.
Thank you very much, Richard. We also have with us Florin Tudorie from the Permanent Mission of Romania here in Geneva, and other colleagues and interns from the Geneva Internet Platform. Just before I give the floor to Sally, as you are aware, Diplo Foundation and the Geneva Internet Platform project has partnered with the Internet Society in the online pillar of the Geneva Internet Platform, an observatory on online policy issues called the Digital Watch. And we hope that you're already using this resource. If not, please feel free to talk to me more about how it could possibly help your work, and give us feedback, because in a way this tool is designed to help your lives easier. The idea also was that about 4 times a year, we will organize these briefings, common webinars addressing various issues that are hot on the digital politics agenda. And again, taking advantage of the beginning of the year, we have tried to build a bit more on the very exciting forecasting exercises. So I would like to ask Sally now, coming from the technical community, to provide us with your views on what you think were the major issues closing 2015. What do you think we should keep an eye on for 2016, and what will the policy and technology interlink, in your view, look like? Thank you, Sally.
Is this working properly? Everyone hear me? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and hello to everyone online. It's great to see you all here. And I see Jovan making his way down the hallway. So I think many of you in the room are familiar with the Internet Society, but is there anyone here who doesn't know who we are, who would like to hear a bit more? Okay, good. Well, that means a lot to us. That means that you know who we are, and that's always a good thing. Hello, Jovan. That's okay. Come on, have a seat. We've been winging it in your absence. We'll let you catch your breath.
Timing wasn't ideal because there are many people who would like to attend, but they are finishing now.
Okay. So Teresa asked me what we thought were the main issues that were closing 2015, and then look ahead a bit to 2016. I think it's fair to say that 2015 was a big year in the internet governance theme or track. There was a lot of work done across the UN system to prepare for the WSIS plus 10 meeting at the end of the year in December in New York. UNESCO, the ITU, a number of stakeholder organizations, et cetera, held a lot of meetings and a lot of discussion leading up to WSIS about what was the progress that had been made since 2010 to achieve since 2005, excuse me, to achieve the goals that were set out by the World Summit on the Information Society, and then to look ahead and see what more needed to be done. And in the middle of all that, the UN also held, as I think all of you are well aware, the Sustainable Development Summit, where they adopted at the highest levels the Sustainable Development Agenda, which will really shape the UN agenda in the development space for years to come. So the WSIS, I think, was certainly shaped by these events, this dialogue on internet governance, combined with the Sustainable Development Agenda that was coming out of New York. And those things really came together in December at the WSIS. Naturally, there was a discussion as well on what are the roles of the various stakeholders? Does this multi-stakeholder model still hold? And is there consensus around that? By and large, I think the consensus, excuse me, from 2005 has held with respect to the multi-stakeholder model. But this is a conversation that keeps coming up and keeps coming back, again, as governments become more and more interested and affected by the internet policy discussions and want to be more and more engaged in them. Alongside this, of course, was a tremendous amount of work being done, particularly in the technical community, but not exclusively, related to the IANA transition. I assume many of you in this room have heard about the IANA transition? No? Okay, all right, that's good. I don't want to make any assumptions. There are a set of core technical functions that make the internet work that are highly technical, but they relate to the protocol development for the internet, the assignment of numbers, and the assignment of domain names. And the IANA, this is called is a function that helps keep a registry of all of the information that needs to be in place for these allocations to happen and for the internet to continue to work. This is a function that has been performed, largely administrative function that's been performed by ICANN for many years now, pursuant to a contract with the United States government, the Department of Commerce. And in 2014, the Department of Commerce announced that they were ready to step away from that contract and turn the responsibility for these functions over to the multi-stakeholder community, but that they needed a proposal from the community on how this would continue to operate securely in a stable fashion, reliably, for the future operation and growth of the internet. And so since March of 2014, this community, both within ICANN and elsewhere in the technical community, has been deeply engaged in figuring out what does that proposal look like. Does it meet the criteria that the United States government has put in place that says we will relinquish this role so long as these certain criteria have been met? And there's a lot of interest, of course, from all of us to make sure that the internet continues to grow and that these functions continue to be stable. So in 2015, there was an enormous amount of work being done, thousands and thousands of messages and meetings and hours spent to figure out exactly what needed to be in place to ensure that these functions could be securely transferred to the multi-stakeholder community. And this is a big deal. This has been a sore spot for many governments around the world when it comes to the internet, that a single country, in this case the United States, had a disproportionate role in the functioning of the internet, or at least it was perceived that way with the contract. And it was also an important moment to say, that the multi-stakeholder model was prepared to take on this set of functions, that the community was mature enough to put the checks in place, that there was legitimacy in the process, and that there was accountability, right? If we're turning this over completely to the multi-stakeholder community, how do you ensure accountability in that system? if it's not purely accountable just to a government. So I think 2015 was a big year for that. We're still not done, but we're ever closer, right, Nigel? We're ever closer. Almost there. And hopefully, I think the goal is that in 2016, a consensus proposal will go to the United States government to take action. And if all goes as planned, that the contract between ICANN and the United States government will expire in September of 2016. This is certainly the timeline that everybody's working towards. So the IANA transition was a big deal in 2015. I think it will continue to be a big deal in 2016. But we came out of 2015 with, like I said, a fairly strong WSIS consensus. I'm not sure it was universal, but I think we had a strong consensus coming out of the WSIS that internet governance should continue to be this collaborative multi-stakeholder model, that different stakeholders have different roles in the system, but that ultimately the decisions around the internet work best when the parties collaborate and when they bring their expertise to the table. My sense in 2016, yeah, and I'll be interested in Jovan's view on this as well, is that this is now the period to really show how that model works in practice. There are key issues that we are all grappling with in the internet. At the Internet Society, we've identified our two big priorities for 2016. The first to be access. We still have to get the rest of the world online. And there are barriers to connectivity around the world that we have to deal with and we have to overcome. And until we have connectivity everywhere and affordable and open access to the internet, we really don't have the promise of the information society that we all set out for ourselves. So that's a key priority for the Internet Society. The other is trust. It's all well and good if we're online, but we have to trust the medium. For the internet to really reach its potential in people's lives, they need to trust that their information is secure, that their personal information is their personal information to control, that the networks themselves, that the infrastructure is secure. So the issues related to trust and security and privacy, we think are paramount for the coming year or more ahead. And I think this is a space where this model, this collaborative model, it really needs to show that it can work. There's a tremendous amount of work being done at the technical level related to security. How do you secure networks? How do you secure routing? How do we secure the domain name system? How do we put in privacy protections in place? Can we make encryption work end to end? All of these things to make the experience more secure. And we also need the policy environment to help with that and not hinder it. So I think these are the, and I think from our perspective, we've titled this collaborative security. This notion that no one party, no one stakeholder is going to push a button somewhere and make it all secure. There are layers upon layers of action that need to happen. You can have technical protocols in place, but if you don't have the legal frameworks, or if you don't have the commercial practices, we aren't secure. If the secure practices infringe on freedom of expression, then we don't have an open internet. If practices gather up data without consent, then users' privacy is impacted and they don't trust the medium. So all of these things are interrelated. And I think this is the period now where all of us, not just governments, but we all expect some results from these processes that result in greater trust in the internet. So maybe I'll just pause there. I hope all of you have seen this. Teresa was kind enough. The January 7th version of the Digital Watch has Diplo's predictions for 2016, which I think actually mirror a lot of what I would say is on the agenda. But Jovan, do you want to speak to the 2016 future, the crystal ball?
Thank you for well, it is easy task, Sally, after you. Good afternoon. I'm a big apology for a delayed arrival due to the norms meeting at about the future GG, Governmental Group of Experts. Was the discussion at just across the street, but still we needed Alex and me 5 minutes. I was a bit faster than you, Alex, in running. Well, it is, Sally, it's great to share the panel with you, and I think I have an easy task since you outlined the major challenges and you explained how this long 2015 will continue. I like history, and you know there is this notion of the long century, long 19th century, long the 20th century. It doesn't end with 1999, which continues conceptually into the. And I think it will be longer year 2015. Yes, we closed the. We have final document of the verses, but there will be issues that will continue as you indicated. And since you outlined the major challenges in terms of processes, the major challenge for the IGF, I will have a luxury to give a bit broader views and real crystal ball exercise.
Okay.
You know, that's the thing. But one point which you mentioned on the multi-stakeholder approach and general inclusion in the policy processes. One aspect which is extremely important and which the internet community should focus on is check and balances aspect. The more eyes we have around the table, the more transparent the process is. And those check and balances mechanisms in the IGF, in the international organizations, in the ICANN, are extremely important. And that can bring some sort of more informed and more better, not necessarily better policy making, because it can prolong the policy making process, but this is important aspect. What I thought of in this crystal ball exercise, focusing on 3 predictions. The first one is related to business model, and I don't know if, well, those of you who are attending Diplo's courses, you're probably tired of my triangle outlining our position as users with regard to internet intermediaries and business community. Basically, as you know, we as users, we contribute, we get services from Google, Facebook, and other companies without monetary sort of exchange. In exchange, we provide the data. Those companies are data mining, and they are basing their business model on the extensive data mining. And I think to the large extent, as far as I'm concerned, I have a terrible big talent for languages, for learning languages, which you can notice from my speech. Therefore, Translate Google is a perfect deal for me. I don't mind giving data to Google if they give me this great software, Translate Google. But that deal between us and the Google and Facebook is not always transparent, because and this coming more and more as an issue. And in this triangle, we will be having more and more discussions on the question of business model, question of taxation, data movement. And the first event which will address it, what I'm hearing from preparatory process, is OECD meeting in digital economy in Mexico during June or July. June this year. As you know, OECD has been always proactive in addressing the digital policy issues from the 80s, from 90s, and I think they are trying to find some sort of solution which should enable the innovative engine to continue moving to developing things, but in the same time protecting the interest of users and public interest in the issues like taxation. And for those of you who are following European digital policy scene, you know that the big issue is the question of taxation of Apple, Google in the UK, in Italy, in France, and other places. Therefore, this is probably the first conceptual framework where we will have more and more policy discussions, most likely more on conceptual level, but there will be requests, as it came from the UK government, the French government, the Italian government, to answer the question of taxation and fiscal income. Therefore, there will be pressure around this first triangle. The second triangle, second triangle deals with something that we discussed at the UNGG meeting this morning, and we are discussing very often. It is interplay between security, human rights, and business. In many digital policy issues, you have that request that you cannot address them in isolation. You cannot deal only with the question of data, for example, privacy. In the Human Rights Council, data is also the core of modern economy. It's addressed in WTO. It is addressed in the standardization bodies, in ITF, in ISO, in the ITU. Therefore, there will be more and more pressure to create some sort of dynamics in this triangle. And it is to the large extent what is happening in Geneva. Around data, you have WTO, just across the street, Human Rights Council, ISOC and ITF on the other side of the river, ITU, and other players. And that will be increasingly interplayed. You can find many examples. Question of encryption, balance between cybersecurity and human rights, or not, or win-win solution, or zero sum. These issues are coming into the forefront. They are now in the public debate, but policymakers have to address them because they have to find reasonable, good policy solutions. This is therefore the second triangle, the second dynamics where we can expect more and more movements. In the third one, oh, not that one. Okay. It's in the wrong PowerPoint. Okay, you can move back to the second one. The third one is related to the question of the instruments in digital policy space. At the meeting at the UN, there was discussion about activities of the next UN government group of experts that should start later in 2016. As you know, the first group issued the report, the second, third iteration, issued a report in June this year, in June 2015, stating that international law applies to the internet. To the large extent, it was an important outcome given the dynamics that you had all countries, including countries in some frictions in digital field. Everybody was around the table. They stated more or less obvious, but sometimes in diplomacy it's important to start with stating obvious. Therefore, international law applies to the internet. Now, the question is that how fast international community will be in addressing this void, not only in terms of norms, but also in terms of interpretation of norms. We have quite solid set of norms on human rights, on commercial trade, on the other issues, and they are well established. But how to apply them to the internet? Now, my concern, I would say serious concern, is that slowness of international community and careful and balanced approach, which will balance this dilemma, security, human rights, business, could be easily filled or could be overcome by juridical activities. And this is what has been happening, in particular in Europe. If you don't have the answer to your question, then Europeans go to the European Court of Justice. They ask the question on the right to be forgotten. There was a ruling, which is now de facto international norms, which Google has to apply. With all open questions, is Google a juridical body? Is it fair to put such a burden on Google to process 500,000 requests? But this is reality. There is a judgment of European Court of Justice. There is another judgment which was on Safe Harbor Agreement, which is not new norm, which is more interpretation, again creating a lot of policy dynamics. We are waiting now for major judgment which will be on interpretation if Uber is information or transportation company. It will come in the second part of this year. Again, with a huge impact, not only on European digital space, but also on global. Now, my major concern is that judges have a certain approach. They have a legal training. I'm a lawyer by training, but they apply certain mindset and certain professional approach, which is not necessarily, in all cases, adequate for addressing complexity of digital policy issues. Therefore, in short-term dilemma which we'll be facing in 2016 and 2017 is how agile and dynamic we will be in creating a reasonable policy space on internet governance, which will be reduce the need for juridical interventions and de facto creating norms through the decisions of the courts. Therefore, first one, business model, adjusting policy space to business model, and the major event, probably OECD event in Mexico. Second one, interplay between cybersecurity, human rights, and business, addressed almost on daily basis in Geneva and other places. And third one, the risk that court decision could become de facto rules for cyberspace.
Thanks, Giovanna. Maybe we have a bit of a conversation here, but when the Internet Society took a step back a couple years ago to look at what we think is the Internet, what are the principles or the characteristics of the Internet, and we have referred to those as the Internet invariants. Apparently, that's not a great headline, but in any event, these things about the Internet that we think continue to be true or need to continue to be true for this to truly be the Internet. And one of those things is, this notion of the end-to-end principle, this notion of global interconnection, that the Internet is about connecting networks. And that's both a physical infrastructure connection, but it's also a human connection. You are connecting networks of people and of devices to each other. The other is this idea of permissionless innovation, that you can continue to innovate and change the very things that we think are stable today. There are people who say the TCP/IP maybe will or will not be the protocol of the future. There are no permanent favorites. Things don't last forever. If you go back, those of you who were using the Internet in the early days, Alta Vista was the search engine that was going to change the world, and now it's moved on and another one has taken its place. That's okay, and that's good in the Internet space. We see a lot of evolution. We see a lot of change. So in light of what Jovan has outlined, I think the question that we would have and the concern that we have about some of these trends is the extent to which those start to infringe upon those core properties of the Internet that we think are still profoundly important. So if you think about these instruments and this interplay between international jurisprudence and the domestic or the regional level, we certainly wouldn't deny that policymakers are going to get involved, and they're looking at these things from consumer protection points of view, security, et cetera. But the extent to which we start to see this bifurcation of jurisdiction around the world, and we will be looking at that from the vantage point of what does it do to those core properties of the Internet? Do you still get global interconnection? Can you still get to connect people and communities the way you do today? Or are we getting behind, people call them walled gardens, and those can be commercial, they can be political, they could be regional, but are we starting to lock people in rather than opening up a world of possibility? And these are very real considerations when you look at business models, for example, when you look at the commercial trends towards keeping people in a particular service or application, the data that gets collected as a result of that. It's certainly a big deal when it comes to security. And the extent to which people feel like they can express themselves online freely without being attacked or traced or surveilled. And then in terms of the instruments themselves, are they divisive in terms of the Internet, or are they lining up to bring some stability, legal stability to the space without creating barriers? So I think these sort of things are not abstract. They have real life meaning. As you said with Google, certainly the Uber decision, all of these things have real life implications. They are not abstract principles. And that's what I think I meant when I said in 2016 and beyond, this is really about taking this model and we're going to see tangible outcomes for good or for bad related to those principles.
Thank you.
Just a quick comment on and the last bilateral exchange. What you just outlined are the core principles, which I would say all of us around the table and community support strongly. And the question of openness, question of the universal internet, and other issues. My main concern is that the principles that are understood in our community, let's say IGF versus ISO community, are simply far from consideration of the judges in Luxembourg or Strasbourg. And that's the major challenge, how those core principles could be fast enough. This is my concern, that the judgments are coming very fast, could be translated somehow stronger into the core principles that could be legally applied, and then when they make a judgment on some court cases, they have European law or US law or whatever, but they say, okay, there are these principles which are not enshrined into national and international.
Exactly.
This is partial
Partial.
attempt, but they're not enshrined as a core principles.
Right.
That's the real challenge. How to
I agree with that.
Yeah, thank you. Let's continue the conversation with our online participants and in situ. Richard, the first question is yours.
Thank you, Richard Hill here. Yes, I think you're perfectly correct. I mean, both of you described perfectly accurately the situation, and Jovan points out that since we have accepted the principle that offline law applies online, that has the unfortunate consequence that it doesn't exactly match some of the core values, which I would consider to be Zol's. Things that we want, not reality, because as we know, we don't actually have end-to-end connection. We can give lots of examples. I'll just mention China, which has the great national firewall. The internet that the average Chinese person sees, and they're about half of the world's internet users, is not the same as the one that we see. So we have an issue there. Now, how to solve that? Actually, those of us who do international law here, we know what the traditional answer has been. You do a treaty. Now, we can argue that the nation state is obsolete or should be obsolete, but the fact of the matter is it's still there. At present, it's still only nation states that have the sovereign, that have the ability to use force to impose something, either by putting an individual in prison or by bombing a city to destroy it, to get rid of whoever they don't like within that city. This is a reality, and it's not going to go away in the next 20 years. So I think you have to live with that. And so the way we advance here is by doing treaties, and we do in other areas. We do in trade, we do in copyright, with results that I don't like, but at least it's an idea. It's better to have harmonized than the jungle. And so why do we not have any treaties on the internet? Well, in case anybody here is innocent and doesn't know the answer, I don't hesitate to say it. It's because the country that currently benefits from the current arrangements, which is the United States and its European allies to some extent, blocks all attempts have any kind of international agreement on some of the key issues that Jovan is raising. I think we have to get over that. We have to recognize the internet is no longer a US construct. The US cannot impose its point of view, and we have to start going into international forums and have these discussions. And it's a long process. We're not going to have a treaty in 3 years, and it has to be a multi-stakeholder process, of course. But we have to get over that barrier, and we can't pretend that this is not a process where everybody in the world can participate on an equal footing.
Thank you. Richard, would you like to react now, or shall we collect more?
Maybe a few questions.
Okay,
Plenty of time.
Nigel Hickson, and who would like to go?
Thank you very much. So I'm Loyola with a strong French accent. So Jovan, you were talking about the slowness of international organizations or institutions, but then Sally, you were saying that technologies are evolving quite fast. So how can we make sure that, yes, the policy can keep up with the trends when the technologies are evolving really, really fast? You know, because in France at the moment, we are talking a lot around new business models around the internet, and it's quite complicated in terms of economy impact in the French society at the moment. So I would be very interested to see, you know, what would be your recommendations to make sure that we can really follow what's happening within the internet, because it's changing basically all the time. So that's my question.
Thank you, Loyola. Nigel, would you like to ask yours, and then we...
Yes, thank you very much, Nigel Hickson, ICANN. First of all, thank you very much for hosting this, and it's very interesting, and it's very always provocative to hear predictions of what's going to happen in 2016. But then your predictions in 2015 were pretty good, I think. Just really, I suppose a question, a comment on this, on your third area of sort of priorities, and this is the policy legal type void. And I think you've certainly identified something which is very important indeed. But I just wonder whether there is a, you know, and Richard Hill, I think also eloquently mentioned that one way of getting out of this sort of policy void, where we let judges in Luxembourg opine on sort of technical issues which they may or may not be, qualified to take forward, of course, is to have an internet treaty. But, I think there are probably other ways forward rather than having an internet treaty. And this is where I would see in the responsibility of organizations and associations in stepping forward and being slightly more proactive and slightly more clear on what they want in certain policy areas. And as you say, the OECD ministerial is an opportunity for this, although one does wonder, looking at the declaration at the moment, which is fairly high level, whether that's going to achieve such. But there must be other avenues. And one other avenue is the intersessional work of the IGF and work that other people take forward. And I think we do have a responsibility for being a lot clearer as policymakers what we want in certain areas. The lead that India have given us, perhaps, the tray, is it? The regulators come out with some fairly strong statements in terms of open internet or neutrality, free, whatever. Now, whether we agree with that or not, but I think those are the sort of policy statements that generically we should be looking for.
Thank you, Nigel. Ready to absorb more questions?
Yeah. Good.
No, we will take a second round then.
On the first question which Richard mentioned, we have exercised in e-diplomacy. I'll just make the sort of analogy. And e-diplomacy is about using social media in conference rooms, Twitter and Facebook and other things. And we came to the point that in some situations, use of social media in negotiation could be counterproductive. Because all key breakthroughs, Cuba, Iran nuke negotiation, Myanmar, Kosovo negotiations, were done without Twitter in the room. Because if you had, I'm coming from the Balkans, if you had the Twitter of camera in the room, the negotiator will be basically playing for the audience back home. And the purpose of diplomacy would be defeated. Therefore, something which I strongly argue for, which is transparency, inclusion, in some cases, when you see what is the purpose of diplomacy, is to make a more peaceful world, is to solve the conflicts. You say, well, let us give the priority to that. Now, but Deng Xiaoping said once, it's not important whether the cat is black and white. It is key that it can catch the mice or mouse. I'm always difficult with this sort of plurality. But the point back to your question, Richard, the key is that we keep the core values which Sally outlined. And I'm afraid that the arrival to these core values sometimes could be counterintuitive. But the key is to keep those core values. I'm a bit skeptical on the treaty because of the treaty fatigue in the world. Let's put it this way. But it's one of the options that shouldn't be off the table. I think we have, for example, more chances in a way codifying customary law in making. I know that some countries are uneasy with the customary law, but if you have a custom which was created and if governments are observing that, that could be codified by advisory opinion of International Court of Justice in The Hague. They say, hey, the principle which are reiterated by OSCE, by practice of the countries, is that we want open, transparent, inclusive internet, whatever our principles are. Therefore, that I think we will have to think a bit out of the box in finding the way. And based on my analogy, sometimes you need discrete, not secret negotiation in order to bring the peace to the regions. I don't argue for the discrete or secret negotiation in internet governance. I think transparency is the key, and more eyes around the table and more check and balances. But that use of the tools, we should be quite open. When it comes to Leila's question about slow, I put as a slow politics, fast digital developments. I argued in my prediction for 2016 that we benefited a lot over the last 10 years by having slow politics, digital politics, in spite of fast technological developments. And if you really compare 2005 Tunis agenda and versus plus 10 documents, is basically copy and paste, which is in this context, I would say, favorable outcome. We, in the very delicate field of digital policy, where intervention can have a counter effects, we were careful, and to some extent, it facilitated fast technological development. Now, the worst thing that one can follow in the sort of cognitive science is to apply the past experience uncritically to the future developments. The logic would be, let us continue with the slow policy developments because it worked the last 10 years. Here I'm more cautious, and I think that especially from this court, the fast dynamism from the juridical bodies, we will have a more and more pressure. Therefore, that slowness of the policy process could be basically overcome by fast courts. And if you ask me, do I prefer decisions by inclusive bodies which understand technical security, human rights aspects, or judges in Luxembourg, Washington, whatever, Hague maybe, International Court of Justice, my preference is for inclusive bodies where issues are discussed in its complexity. Therefore, that I cannot do any, but I am afraid that the logic will be changing a bit. Logic from the last 10 years, which were quite well.
You know, one thing that occurs to me, we often talk about the multi-stakeholder model purely in light of how do we get more stakeholders into the room in government decision making. And while that I think is important, I don't think it's the only dimension of the multi-stakeholder model that we need to focus on. And the reason I say that is partly to your point, and we come from the technical community, Nigel here from ICANN, also in the technical community, where there is an effort underway to get government input into the technical processes. So, and in the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, you don't come in as the government of France and say, this is our point of view, but there are officials and government representatives that are technical that are trying to work through these processes. And the point of that is to say that the technical community also needs to hear from other stakeholders. So it's not just governments that need to hear from the stakeholders. So an example that often comes up in the IETF is emergency communications. They're working on how do you ensure emergency communications in a voice over IP environment. So we're no longer in a traditional telecom environment, but we're now in an IP environment, and you want the equivalent of the 911 call to go through. And a lot of that protocol work is going to be done at the IETF. But it's pursuant to domestic interests, right? Public safety interests of countries. And there's a need for some of that policy input. This is not just at the IETF. We see this in the Government Advisory Committee of ICANN. We see this in the W3C, other places. So, you know, I think as the technology is evolving, there is a role for government to become engaged and understand the technical evolution where it's happening. At the same time, I think, I mean, I certainly agree with Jovan, this idea of the slow politics and the fast evolution, and that's certainly been, I think, a frustration of governments for a long time. If you can somehow, I don't think there's a magic solution, but if you can somehow legislate or look to the principles that you're trying to promote or protect or get in place, that to me allows you the space for evolution. So when we try to get down to say we're going to solve this technical problem as the government with this business model for today or this year or for this year and next year, by the time that happens, that business model has long moved on. But if you can look at a more generalized approach at this principle level, whether it's related to privacy or related to consumer protection, then you don't box yourself into today's environment. Because what often ends up happening is these policies, you know, one of the invariants that I talked about was there are no permanent favorites. In making very specific policy, you can inadvertently create a favorite that then the market can't move out when it's no longer useful to users or people don't want to use it anymore or whatever. You've built it into your regulatory system, and it's hard then to move on. So I think that would be my consideration, and that may be where I come out on the treaty. I think, like Jovan, I'm more skeptical not eliminating the option, but more skeptical, because I do worry that as we bind things with the vision that we have in front of us, even if we have the crystal ball that Jovan has, can we really write a treaty today that can be sustainable and allow that kind of evolution over decades? I mean, I'm open to great ideas of how that happens, but the past has not given me that level of comfort.
Thank you, Sally and Jovan. Just before second round here in Geneva, what's the dynamics in the online space, Emmanuel?
Thank you. Yeah, from the online participants, we have 3 questions. 2 are more for the ICANN and for Nigel. And the first one is, well, Nigel mentioned we need other avenues, but are there any multi-stakeholder fora that can truly address legal instruments for the internet? This is the first one. Also on ICANN topic, well, there's a question about the ICANN's new CEO, which is this geopolitical impact. And the third question is about the approaches to solving the issues of language as a barrier to access. So what is the speaker's point of view on this topic? Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuela. I will let Nigel Hickson to react on the 2 first questions.
Jovan, one would expect nothing else. I think the first question was more for Sally. But let me take the second one first. And I mean, well, just to note, yesterday I can announce that the new chief executive taking over from Khalid Jihadi will be Yoran Malbi. I'll get the name right in there.
ICANN maybe.
Yeah, who's currently the head of the telecommunication regulator in PTS in Sweden, and of course we're delighted that he'll be on board and taking up his role hopefully in May or June. I think the first question. Well, let Sally have a go first, and then perhaps I'll. Sorry.
Can you read it again? I understood the question was, are there any multi-stakeholder places that could be adequate to develop these kinds of instruments? Is that essentially? It's a good question, and others in the room might also be qualified to answer this. I do think we're starting to see different kinds of models that aren't exclusively government developing best practices or norms that, as Jovan said, eventually evolve into these legal, have some sort of legal standing. I know in the United States and I think BEREC might be an example as well of a process that has multiple parts to it, industry, et cetera, that come together and create certain policy outcomes. Now, the legal binding nature of things, I think, governments write laws. So ultimately, for something to be legally enforceable, I think it needs to be government sanctioned. But there are instances where government has said, we will not develop this. We're looking to a coalition. We're looking to some entity to develop these best practices or these norms that we will then adopt as part of our legal framework. And we've seen that happen, I think, in a lot of environments. Jovan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just one quick comment is that norms can have different sources. One of the major is to have a treaty, to adopt a treaty, but there are other sources like customary law, unilateral declaration, decision of international organizations, and de facto standards.
Right.
Standards are increasingly becoming. Probably one that could be a challenge for PhD thesis to argue that IETF is developing some sort of globally applicable norms. That could be, some lawyers could be very nervous about this argument, but that could be an interesting thesis to do research if somebody is looking for the team for PhD research. Now, what I was indicating by spending time with the governmental officials in different fora now, this morning in the cybersecurity and recently in the OSCE cybersecurity, we tend to simplify potential reaction of governments. Governments are not, even governments whom we suspect that would like to regulate, are not very often extremely keen to regulate. They're aware that this field is a messy policy issue, that you have to walk it very clearly. There are quite a few banana skins around, and that there is a cautious. And I think that simplified rule that governments are dreaming every morning how to make a new laws and regulation is not necessarily correct. The problem is that they have a pressure. They have a pressure from public, they have pressure from parliament, and that pressure will increase. And the government officials, ministers, politicians, waiting for next elections or having to take care of their careers, they will have to address this pressure. And that will be another thing that we can expect more and more. Very simple pressure. What's happening with my Facebook account? What about my photos on the server? Which could sound for us in Volga IGI rather trivial questions, but those are questions of the ordinary users and us as citizens. Therefore, that would be another dynamics which we have to see how to address that pressure to deal with the concrete policy issues. The more we can be inclusive, with more eyes around the table, with balances, technical community making these norms, the better.
I agree.
And I think that could be the key challenge that we have to face. There was a question on multilingualism, which I think ISOC is the best to answer. You have been doing really a lot on the language.
Right. I think the question was, again, if you can correct me if I missed it, to what extent are languages still a barrier to access? Am I getting that question correctly?
Sorry?
The third question was on languages.
Yeah, there are languages to accessing.
So, it's something that we at ISOC are thinking a lot about. We think of the access question, there's a supply side issue, right? Do you have the infrastructure available, whether it's spectrum or submarine cables or fiber, copper, et cetera? Do you have the physical infrastructure available for access? But then there's this component of demand. If there's all this infrastructure, but none of us think it's relevant or can't read it in our own language, or don't see the benefit of it, don't trust it, then all of that supply side doesn't, it overreaches the demand. And so we're really looking at some of these demand issues. And certainly the language issue is a big component of that. There's a tremendous amount of content emerging in local native languages, but it's certainly not enough. There needs to be much more of that. And local content developed, in country, in region that's relevant to the end users of that area. And this goes, of course, to government services as well. One of the big ways that these technologies become relevant is when you need to use them for the services you expect to receive, whether that's banking or interaction with your equivalent of Social Security, et cetera. I know in my own family, that was one of the big drivers, was when Social Security and Medicare forced online banking, then, certain members of my family became a lot more interested in the internet than they were before. But imagine if you can't do that based on your local language, restrictions. So it's a big issue, and there are things that governments can do. There are things that the technical community can do. Certainly the effort around multilingual domain names has been or internationalized domain names has been a huge step forward in that direction. And also figuring out what are the incentives in country to create this local content. Again, if the demand side is a big deal, are there barriers to that? We're seeing in some countries that even if they have all the infrastructure in the world, the content still is hosted somewhere else because there isn't the economic or the legal infrastructure at home for it to logically come home. So these are all pieces of a puzzle, and it's not enough to just have content available, you have to have all these different pieces of that ecosystem in place to really take advantage of it. So I think there were two questions over here that I want to make sure we
there are more
don't.
online as well, but let's move to the room now. Cisse?
Thank you, and once again, congratulations to Diplo for having organized this, and ISOC for having organized this session. And I had 3 fears and concerns. One is that actually, in my point of view, internet is really business driven, and I'm really afraid of where we are going if you are only in the hand of big companies. And that's what's my inspiration. If I look at the triangle I saw a few minutes ago, because then you see, for example, that business models are dominating the societal aspect. When I look back to the VCs, there were very nice texts on inclusion, on participation, on local contents, on knowledge society. But what I see here is only business. And I have a fear there. If you can reassure me of how we can tackle it, or if I am wrong, maybe you explain me more, please. The second question is about still the connectivity and access versus knowledge society. Sometimes I hear people saying that you have 400% mobile increasing, but it's not enough. Mobile, they just pick your money and you pay the internet, you talk. Maybe you give them your money, but if you look in Africa, most of us are only consumers. We are not part of the game. And also, this is a concern for me. The connectivity is good, but still we are at 20% connection in Africa. And in many countries, they are at 80%. They are talking about cloud, they are talking about virtualization, and we are always at 20%. And what is your idea about the issue? The third issue is this issue of language. It has been raised now, but I've just give you 2 examples. One is IANA transition, whole process in English. How many people are left away from the process? If you propose that we put it as an international body, we talk with inclusiveness, we put everybody on the table, many eyes, but you have only Anglo-Saxon eyes. I'm sorry. I speak English, that's why I'm here. If I was not speaking English, I come here, I don't catch anything. Second example, 2 weeks ago, I tried to tend to have 100% translation in 3 or 4 languages. Still, they are not African languages, but we try to be in the game. But then I have been told at ITU, you cannot apply if you don't put it in English. So where is inclusiveness? Where are we going? I'm really concerned about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sis. Please.
Yeah, this is Stephen. I just wanted to come back to Jovan and your third point again, the issue of instruments in the digital policy space. Given the slow politics and the fast developments, how do you practically see the development of such digital policy instruments, and what might they be, and what kind of forces are needed for such digital policy instruments to be developed and implemented?
Thank you. Any other questions here in the room? Mr. Klein.
Michael Kleiner from the Geneva Economic Development Office. Thank you very much for this, for mentioning that the internet is business driven. I think that's very important also. You're missing out a little bit the economic weight of the big companies and how they also put pressure. You said the pressure comes from the individual when he says he wants to have access to his Facebook account. But I think the pressure is more from Facebook itself. And they say, you know, at the beginning, they want everything to be open. So they want the regulations to be open and to be able to do whatever they can. And then the more they grow, the businesses, they want to be protected and they want to protect their business models. So that's also a big source of pressure, a big source of normative pressure on who wants, because then they claim that they, of course, they make your economy work and they give you jobs, etc. And so they need their models to be protected. So I think that aspect also has to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Any? Yes, Alex Tregona, Special Envoy of the Prime Minister of Malta.
Hello, yes, Alex Tregona. Good afternoon. I'm going to put forward a very simple question, although the rationalization behind it is enormous, which I won't lump you with this afternoon. But we were discussing yesterday at the World Trade Organization preparations for reconciling or attempts at reconciling European efforts at removing barriers to the European digital single market and the global market in digital market, if that exists, or the rest of the world's market. Now that is the market-driven aspect that some have poo-pooed already here, because it's the totally different direction from the knowledge economy that was meant to be the internet's much larger domain. Having mentioned these two domains, it would seem that we would be requiring more and more rules, norms, and principles of a common type in order to reconcile different geopolitical interests in the world because of the development of the internet as a cross-border means of communication. The essential problem of what we're doing at the UN this morning with the GGE is that the internet has grown out of the US and has become a lingua franca in communications worldwide, but it is still regulated extraterritorially from Marina del Rey in California. Now, we've come to the other extreme this morning, that one participant right up there at the Palais was accusing the ECJ in its judgment on safe harbor, and more recently with the privacy shield, protection shield, as adjudicating extraterritorially. So crystal ball number one for 2016 is, are we going to have more of these insults across the pond of adjudicating extraterritorially? And how, if at all, can we manage to reconcile them? Now, without going so far into the distant future of crystal balls, I'll retain the original part of the question, namely, would ISOC be interested in assisting the WTO and the EU in removing barriers to the digital single market in the EU? We need your inputs on that, and in a way that the EU digital single market's rules will be acceptable also cross-border with the rest of the world. Because that is a litmus test of this much larger problem that I was just suggesting from this morning's conversations we were having. Now, nota bene, one final asterisk footnote. Just to tell you where I'm coming from Malta, where we had launched a treaty, this will be very much on Richard Hill's menu, years ago, on the law of the sea. And I've been advocating an analogy of the law of the sea for the internet, basically because it removes unregulated power into law. Now, if we follow Montesquieu's division of legislative, adjudicative, and executive organs in many different forms, that is another matter. But the movement that is going to become more and more interesting in the geopolitics, at least immediately, between the EU and the US, is to remove questions of power, not leaving them as questions of power, but bringing them to law.
Thank you, Alex. And I will just return to Emanuele to round up the discussion from the online space.
Yes, thank you. Yes, there are two questions for Jovan. The first one is if you can expand a bit more on how the taxation issue is being tackled within the OECD minister process, and if the discussion on the topic is there is basically intergovernmental or more of a MSH approach. And then, oh yeah, sorry. And the other one is, also for Jovan, if you can give us your or maybe the DPLOS prediction of what concrete outcome could emerge of this track at the OECD and other venues. In terms of technological challenges, can we change our approach by adopting the transfer of knowledge, the approach of capacity building, which is an approach which doesn't give a guarantee of transfer of knowledge, especially in developed countries, like in Africa?
Thank you. So 4 questions from the room, more from online, multiple.
That gets us anywhere. I think your point on the access versus the knowledge society, I think that's a very good one that comes out of, I remember in the WSIS discussions very well, this question of it's not sufficient just to have access, it's that we actually are creating a society that can use this and innovate off of it. And I mean, I'm hopeful that that's where we're going. I mean, there are days when you spend your whole day on the internet looking at things that don't contribute to your knowledge, certainly. But I do think there's potential there. And I think for Africa, to your point on 20% access, are we building a knowledge society? I do think this is where, and we're starting to see more and more come out of Africa's governments and technical community on entrepreneurship. There is huge room in Africa, and not just exclusively in Africa, to unleash that entrepreneurial spirit so that the applications and services that emerge are useful and relevant in that local context. And so that you're not dependent upon a big corporate presence that you may or may not find attractive. And you do see this coming out of certain environments. Kenya, of course, comes to mind. Rwanda, there are several in Africa that are quite focused on this point, because I do think that entrepreneurship piece can help drive the knowledge society element rather than just access and taking it and being a consumer of rather than a producer of. I know from where we sit, our earliest days and one of our key missions from Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn and others who created the Internet Society was that the power of the internet only exists the more people that are connected to it. And it's not enough to connect people and then leave. You want to create a local community that can build the technology, innovate on the technology, sustain it, maintain it. So it's not just about dropping a connection in and leaving. This is about creating a technical community in countries to manage and run the infrastructure for themselves. And so that to us is our piece of the knowledge society in a way. There's a whole piece of, we do a lot of work on internet exchange points at ISOC, and a lot of our folks will say, it's really only about 20% engineering, and it's 80% community or human engineering. Can you bring the parties around the table to interconnect? Can you create the incentives to do that? And part of that is based on whether you have the knowledge locally to do that well, or are you dependent upon people coming in from the outside? And so one of the ways that we approach development at the Internet Society is really through community development, creating the technical capacity in a country to innovate ultimately. Like if you can build it, if you can maintain it, sustain it, and innovate off of it, that's a development strategy that takes you from just consuming it to really being a knowledge player. But we have a long way to go, I think, and I think your point is quite appropriate. And if countries around the world, don't really focus on this entrepreneurship piece, focus on the technical capacity, then that dependency on a few players is only going to grow.
Just to combine answer to one question which was asked by Michael and Alex on the business, more or less underlying question, what is the role of the business? And I strongly suggest for all of us to read carefully latest World Bank development report on digital dividends, which has the following message. Internet has created enormous possibility for society as innovative engine, and we know it, we experience it that. But they argued also that in order to strengthen positive impact of society and to reduce negative, we need more and more of so-called analog solutions. Therefore, we need analog solutions for digital world, good policies, building of the skills, some of the answers that Sally gave about the more inclusion into the digital space. That's probably the framework. Now, more specifically, I'm more optimistic in this sense. I think business has a strong interest ultimately to have inclusive global policy making. And we're seeing it from the questions around data, around the safe harbor. When the core business model is threatened, then businesses are really coming to the table and say, hey guys, we have to discuss it. There is something wrong. I think that vulnerability of key actors around the table, us as the users, we have sort of limited influence of what's going on with our data, businesses which is the core mandate, and governments which would like to have more access to data. That vulnerabilities of each actor can create a space for some sort of reasonable global negotiations and arrangement in whatever form it takes. Because when the US government sends delegation the first thing in the new year to Silicon Valley to discuss, among other questions, encryption, this is important message. We want the same is happening, by the way, in Europe, in France, and other countries, in UK, in Germany, and other places. Therefore, this is a clear message. We need a reasonable access to data in order to ensure our function. Can we sit around the table and discuss? Then the answer from business says, that's fine, but if we give you data, we can endanger the trust of our users and ultimately our business model. Therefore, everybody has around the table some sort of weaknesses, which is always good precondition for negotiations, because you can have a best agreement to negotiated agreement. In this case, is bad for all actors. Therefore, I'm more optimistic, and what Michael, you indicated, business concerns should be taken into consideration, and that's vital. That's on that. OECD questions, Ottawa principles on taxation. OECD has been the most proactive player when it comes to taxation, and we expect something new coming from them. Capacity building and training is the key. But I would say capacity building 360 zeros, not just one training, coaching, hand-holding, helping institutions moving from private capacity build to institution. Over to you.
Just to conclude, heavy loaded 2015 doesn't seem to make 2016 much easier. Thank you for bringing your perspectives on the milestones, on the challenges. Thank you to all our participants here in Geneva for bringing your perspectives and your questions, and to our colleagues online. Thank you very much. I know there has been a separate dynamism in the online chat room. So thanks to Emanuele for being the bridge to the room. Thank you very much. We will follow up by email. If you have registered to this event, then we have you on the list. We will send you a recording of this event because it has been recorded. We will share with you photos that Alexandra has been making during the event, and please keep in touch, and let's speak together further on what your needs for our activities actually are, because we try to address it this way. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. If you're heading back to the Palais, enjoy the rest of the event there.